Thank you for joining us. I'm Richard Peretz, and our show today will focus on a matter that should concern us all, that of our health. Many of you are hearing that Medicare is facing insolvency. Our guest today is Bill Falloon, the author of an astonishing new book that exposes how today's broken healthcare system is driving America actually into economic ruin. Some of our politicians want us to raise taxes while others insist on cutting Medicare benefits. Bill Falloon says neither can possibly work when institutionalized corruption is the real cause behind our healthcare costs crisis. Just so you know, Bill Falloon is the founder of the Life Extension Foundation, an organization that was established back in 1980. It is the largest anti-aging medicine group in the world, and I've personally benefited from Bill Falloon's health recommendations. His latest book, Pharmocracy, is perhaps the most important one of all, a real eye-opener. Bill, I've asked you to be on our show today because your book is absolutely astonishing. It is so provocative, and I don't think anyone has pulled together as much hard data on this topic as you have. So the question is, why can't Americans afford health care like they used to?
The culprit behind today's healthcare crisis is overregulation. Inefficient and corrupt government policies have caused medical prices to spiral out of control. The travesty is that Medicare faces an unfunded liability of such magnitude that no one knows how to pay for it. Your audience will be shocked to find out that the only reason this nation's sick care system is descending into bankruptcy are inept regulations.
A question on so many people's minds is, how bad is Medicare's financial situation today?
According to the latest report, Medicare's unfunded liability is $24.6 trillion. That means for the government to meet its future Medicare obligations, it should have $24.6 trillion in a trust fund earning interest. But even this gargantuan number is understated as politicians constantly manipulate the numbers. The most recent official report states that Medicare's hospital fund will go bankrupt 5 years sooner than what Medicare's trustees estimated only 1 year ago. The government does not have the money to cover its future Medicare obligations. And Medicaid, which provides health care for lower income people, also has trillions of dollars of unfunded liabilities.
You know, Bill, these amounts are way too gigantic to imagine. The federal government only takes in about $2 trillion each year in total tax revenue. How is it ever going to fund 24 of $37 trillion of Medicare obligations?
It's mathematically impossible for the government to cover its Medicare obligations, let alone Medicaid, veterans, federal employees, and the many other sick care programs it is on the hook for. What no one understands is that healthcare costs are set to skyrocket even further as mediocre new drugs the FDA is approving are costing around $100,000 per patient.
This, of course, is very troubling. Can you give us some examples?
The FDA just approved a drug called Yervoy to treat melanoma that cost $120,000. This drug only extends survival in advanced melanoma patients by 4 months. So for each extra day of life, this drug is costing $1,000. And that's on top of all the other expenses related to treating this lethal cancer. A drug to treat prostate cancer called Provenge is just now making it into the hands of patients, and it will cost $93,000 per patient. Avastin is a mediocre drug the FDA approved to treat breast cancer. It costs most patients around $84,000. The FDA now says this drug does not work for breast cancer and has withdrawn its approval. Some breast cancer patients will pay out of pocket for Avastin because it can relieve metastatic bone pain and it has extended survival in isolated cases. But how many people can afford to pay $84,000?
So, Bill, what do you propose in order to resolve the problem in your new book, Pharmocracy?
The only solution to today's healthcare cost crisis is to repeal draconian laws that have granted a virtual monopoly to the entrenched medical establishment. Unless we restore a free market in the medical field, no one, including government, business, or the individual, will be able to afford the outlandish cost of healthcare. Do you realize how artificially inflated even generic drug prices are, Richard?
I was under the impression that generic drugs saved people a lot of money.
Some generic drugs cost virtually nothing, while others are egregiously overpriced. Take the drug valacyclovir, for example. It's used, by the way, to treat herpes and shingles outbreaks. When it came out as a generic, it cost over $7 a tablet. Some people need to take it daily to prevent herpes outbreaks. That means for this one drug alone, people had to spend $200 a month or $2,400 a year for a drug whose patent expired years ago. Prices of generic drugs fluctuate daily, and prices have come down recently for valacyclovir. But do you know how little it costs to make this drug?
You know, I don't think anyone knows what it really costs to manufacture drugs. What's your thoughts on this?
The cost to make a 1-month supply of valacyclovir is $2.10. Yet up until recently, consumers were being charged over $200 a month for generic valacyclovir. That's a markup of 100 times over the cost of manufacture for a drug that long ago lost its patent status. Life Extension calculated that in a free market environment described in my book Pharmacracy, the price of a month's supply of valacyclovir would plummet to only $6 if it were not for the burdensome FDA regulations that exist over generic drug manufacturing.
This is all really difficult to accept. Can you give us other examples of this kind of price gouging?
Finasteride is another generic drug used to treat benign prostate disease. It cost over $90 for a 1-month supply, which is absurd because, again, the patent expired a long time ago. In the free market approach advocated in Pharmacracy, the price of finasteride would drop to under $10 a month. These obscene profits earned by pharmaceutical companies are being paid for by our Medicare, Medicaid, and private insurance system. We just can't afford it anymore.
Bill, what is the most egregious overpricing of a drug caused by these misguided FDA regulations?
Colchicine is a drug used to treat gout. It's been sold as a low-cost generic since the 19th century. The FDA granted a monopoly to a pharmaceutical company in exchange for them conducting a short-term clinical study. The response was the price of colchicine went from 9 cents a pill to $5 a pill, which is a 50-fold increase. Medicare to Medicaid were paying $1 million a year for colchicine prescriptions, but because of the FDA-created monopoly, Medicare and Medicaid's annual cost has shot up to $50 million each year, and this is just for one artificially overpriced drug.
An obvious question I must ask you is, how is this affecting people's finances, the pocketbooks of Americans?
Employers are paying more than twice as much per employee now compared to year 2001. Employees with insurance coverage have to pay more of their own medical insurance premiums, along with higher deductibles and copays. Employees with health insurance are expected to pay over $4,000 in health insurance premium subsidies and out-of-pocket expenses compared to almost nothing 10 years ago. Those who pay for their own medical insurance coverage have seen their premiums skyrocket. Healthcare costs are expected to double again in the next 10 years. It's clear that Americans cannot afford to pay for today's broken healthcare system. We have to tear down the antiquated regulations.
Considering social responsibility and ethics, what role does Congress have in allowing these extortionist prices for prescription drugs?
Pharmaceutical lobbyists have induced Congress to erect barriers against free market competition. The result is that medical prices are far higher than what they should be. What's most infuriating is that when drug prices shot up to unaffordable levels, pharmaceutical interests wrote legislation called the Medicare Prescription Drug Act, and Congress passed it. This bill mandates that the federal government pay full retail prescription drug prices for people who cannot afford the extortionate cost.
How much will the Medicare Prescription Drug Act cost taxpayers?
Congress was initially told that the Medicare Prescription Drug Act would cost $395 billion. 2 weeks after the bill was enacted into law, Medicare released data showing its true cost to be $534 billion, instead of the $395 billion that Congress was initially told. In sworn testimony before Congress, the higher $534 billion cost was intentionally withheld on orders from a Medicare official who went to work for a high-powered Washington law firm 10 days after the bill was signed into law. The congressman most responsible for passing the Medicare Prescription Drug Act retired to a $2 million a year job with the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America. 2 years after the Medicare Prescription Drug Act was passed, the White House projected the cost to be $1.2 trillion. 3 times more than Congress was initially led to believe. So in answer to your question, Richard, Congress makes rules that grant pharmaceutical companies the ability to charge exorbitant prices for prescription medication, often at taxpayer expense. And those who bestow taxpayer dollars to pharmaceutical companies personally benefit after they leave their government positions.
You know, Bill, one might think that with all of this government regulation, we should at least have safer drugs. Is that the case?
Not so. Government regulations cause us to have more dangerous drugs. It costs so much to gain approval that companies engage in criminal acts to protect their obscene profits. Drug companies use their surplus billions to lobby Congress and the FDA to get dangerous drugs approved. And then they keep these dangerous drugs on the market years after their lethal side effects are uncovered. Drug company profits are used to pay doctors all kinds of incentives to prescribe them, even when patients would be better off using lower-cost drugs that have a better track record of safety.
Well, this is really all quite disturbing. Can you give us another example, Bill?
Perhaps the most heinous drug the FDA approved was called Trazolol. It cost $1,000 per injection. Trazolol killed 22,000 Americans after its lethal side effects were uncovered. No criminal charges were ever brought against the maker of Trazolol for intentionally covering up data showing this drug killed Americans. Trazolol was eventually withdrawn from the market because too many Americans were dying. There are dozens of drugs the FDA approved that were later withdrawn because of their lethal side effects.
Bill, over the years you've been harshly critical of the FDA for the past 31 years, in fact. But what actually is the Food and Drug Administration side of that story?
The FDA commissioner was concerned about problems at the FDA and requested an internal report be done to assess the FDA's scientific competence. The commissioner's concern was that this nation was at risk if FDA science is at risk. The FDA's report card on itself revealed the agency suffers from serious scientific deficiencies and is not positioned to meet emerging regulatory responsibilities. In other words, the FDA failed its own report card. In a 60-page report titled FDA Science and Mission at Risk, the FDA admitted its failures across the board.
How does this affect the FDA's ability to evaluate new classes of life-saving medications?
What this report against the FDA means is that the FDA is unable to keep up with scientific breakthroughs that could cumulatively save millions of human lives. So the criticisms that the Life Extension Foundation has leveled against the FDA for over 30 years have been confirmed by the FDA itself. The agency lacks the scientific capability and organizational structure to do its job. And that means millions of Americans suffer and die each year because of the FDA's inability to do what it's supposed to. That is why it is so crucial to deregulate healthcare. FDA overregulation is a big reason why medicine costs so much. Yet the FDA admits it's not capable of doing its own job, so there's no consumer protection being gained. We have this regulated environment, consumers are stuck in it, but we're not getting any benefit.
You mention in your book, Pharmocracy, that Medicare is rife with waste, fraud, and ineptitudes. Can you give us some examples?
Medicare pays tens of billions of dollars in fake claims each year. This occurs when doctors submit bills to Medicare for services never rendered. In some cases, fake clinics are set up that bilk Medicare for tens of millions, then close down and reopen in another location, repeating the same fraud over and over. In some instances, when doctors die, their staff pretends they're still alive and continues billing for services allegedly provided by dead doctors. It is estimated that Medicare is losing 20% of everything it pays out to non-existent or bogus claims.
How else would you say Medicare and Medicaid dollars are being squandered?
It's not only fake billing that is bankrupting Medicare and Medicaid. Congress passes laws that benefit providers of certain medical services so that bonuses are paid if enough expenses per patient are run up. And one egregious example, if a company made 10 at-home visits to a Medicare recipient, then Medicare would pay the provider a $2,200 bonus plus the cost of each at-home visit. This is not a case of fake billing, but an example of how special interests manipulate the Medicare system to cause it to spend much more money than what it should.
You document in your book, Pharmocracy, that the FDA's delay in approving life-saving drugs is causing millions of Americans to needlessly suffer and die. Please give us an example.
In year 2002, a therapy called Provenge was first shown to extend the lives of advanced prostate cancer patients. It took the FDA until 2010 to approve Provenge. Life Extension battled the FDA to persuade the agency to allow prostate cancer patients to gain access to this therapy much earlier. The FDA refused to allow patients to access Provenge for 8 years. Life Extension calculated that 82,000 human life years were lost by the FDA's 8-year delay in approving this one drug called Provenge.
This is really shocking. So many people and so many years of life needlessly lost. How frequently does this occur?
In year 1983, Life Extension recommended to its members that a drug called ribavirin could effectively treat serious viral infections such as hepatitis C and viral pneumonia. Ribavirin has been used throughout the world as a broad-spectrum antiviral medication, but the FDA refused to approve it until the late 1990s. Life Extension calculated that hundreds of thousands of Americans perished needlessly because the FDA suppressed ribavirin so long.
Please give us an example of a drug the FDA knowingly allowed to be sold, even though it knew the data supporting it was fraudulent.
QT is a drug the FDA approved to treat pneumonia, but it causes serious liver damage. In some cases, liver failure develops, necessitating a liver transplant. Some patients die before a donor liver can be found. The risks of liver failure were known before FDA approved QT, but FDA approved it anyway. As the body count piled up, a Senate investigative panel was convened to find out why the FDA continued to allow QT to be sold. In sworn testimony before the United States Senate, the FDA employees intentionally presented fraudulent safety data to justify their approval of QT.
How fraudulent were these data?
While the FDA was presenting the fake data to the United States Senate, a criminal investigation was simultaneously being conducted that found that the clinic where the safety study allegedly occurred was closed during the time the study supposedly took place. It was also determined that documents relating to the safety study had date modifications and signature inconsistencies. Shortly after the fake safety data was presented by the FDA employees, the person who contrived this charade pled guilty and was sentenced to almost 5 years in jail. So here you have FDA employees swearing under oath before the United States Senate that this drug was safe, and the person who conducted the so-called safety study, which never occurred, they were pleading guilty to a crime and were going to jail.
I have to ask you if the FDA ever admitted this was a fraudulent study.
What's even more shocking is that the FDA continued to cite this safety study long after the principal investigator admitted it was fraudulent. While the perpetrator of this safety study sat in prison for falsifying the data, the FDA used the very same study to issue a public health announcement stating that the risks of QT were no greater than other antibiotics, which was a blatant lie.
Doesn't the FDA exert more control over clinical trials as a basis for its decision to approve new drugs?
No, it relies on drug company-sponsored clinical trials that have been known to be falsified and covered up in order to win FDA approval. The FDA drug approval process is a charade perpetrated against the health and pocketbooks of the American public.
How much are Americans overpaying for their prescription drugs?
Americans pay about 9 times more on average for their generic drugs than what the cost would be in the free market environment I propose in pharmacracy. As you can see, back in 2009, prescription drugs could have been obtained for about 80% less were it not for burdensome FDA overregulation of these generic drugs. The chart on page 141 of Pharmacracy, which we're showing on the screen now, reveals just how much Americans are overpaying for their medications.
How much are drug prices increasing?
Prices for patented prescription drugs increase throughout the year, and these increases exceed the rate of inflation. In some cases, price gouging occurs to the extent that Americans can't even afford their medications. For instance, between years 2005 and 2007, the cost of the antidepressant Wellbutrin went up by 44.5%. The cost of the attention deficit drug Adderall went up by 33.5%. And the price of the sleep aid Ambien, that shot up 70%. In my book, Pharmacracy, we reveal what the public is not aware of when it comes to the outlandish prescription drug price increases that our nation is saddled with only because of FDA overregulation.
It's nothing less than outrageous. Are drug prices still increasing this much?
Here's a chart from Pharmacracy showing the price increases that occurred recently on a wide range of drugs. Just imagine you need a cancer drug and you, Medicare or your insurance company, had to fork over almost $5,000 for only 28 pills. Or let's say you wanted to use a drug like Cialis and your cost for 30 pills was over $500. In my book, Pharmacracy, I outline how a free market would result in healthcare costs across the board plummeting, which would spare Medicare from impending insolvency.
Bill, an important question I must ask you is, what simple step can the public take to reduce their need for costly health care?
The simplest way to reduce the demand for costly medical procedures and prescription drugs is for virtually everyone to take at least 5,000 international units of vitamin D each day. Hundreds of published scientific studies document that the incidence of virtually every degenerative disease could be slashed if people take higher doses of vitamin D. The Life Extension Foundation conducted a study of over 13,000 dedicated supplement users, and we found that 85% had less than optimal vitamin D levels in their blood. These supplement users were already taking around 1,000 IUs each day of vitamin D, but they needed to increase it to 5,000 IUs and higher to achieve optimal blood levels of 25-hydroxyvitamin D.
How do government-protected drug price increases compare with free market dietary supplements?
Well, as I showed you earlier, Richard, patented prescription drug prices surge higher every year, and even generic drugs are horrifically overpriced compared to what they would cost in the free market. Dietary supplement prices, on the other hand, which are controlled by the free market and not the federal government, have plummeted in price. For instance, the Life Extension Foundation was the first to introduce coenzyme Q10 to the United States back in 1983. Its price has plummeted by over 75% since then. And the price actually keeps going down lower because more effective ways to enhance coenzyme Q10 absorption have been discovered. Now, if dietary supplements were regulated the way prescription drugs are, consumers would be paying over $330 for a 1-month supply of CoQ10.
It's remarkable and shocking that prices have come down for dietary supplements, yet they've surged so high for prescription drugs. Can you give us another example, please?
A nutrient that Life Extension introduced in 1996 called S-adenosylmethionine, also known as SAMe, now costs 77% less than it did originally. SAMe is sold as an expensive prescription drug in Europe, but in the free market environment for dietary supplements that currently exists in the United States, the price is substantially less. These same price reductions would occur for prescription drugs and other medical services if we tear down the existing regulatory barriers. I document all of this in my book, Pharmacracy.
What happens when the Food and Drug Administration approves a dietary supplement as a prescription drug?
The FDA approved a fish oil prescription drug back in 2006. It cost over $200 for a 1-month supply. The exact same potency of fish oil could be obtained in a dietary supplement for under $30 a month. The price of prescription drug fish oil is now around $175 a month, which is still 6 times higher than what free market fish oil supplements can be obtained for. FDA would like to convert many dietary supplements into prescription drugs, but the Life Extension Foundation has been leading the charge to protect consumers from the extortionist price gouging that will occur if the FDA succeeds in taking away our free access to dietary supplements.
You mention frequently in your book, Pharmacracy, you talk about the deadly impact of FDA censorship. How is this censorship killing Americans?
The FDA is attacking makers of healthy foods like walnuts, cherries, and green tea. The FDA insists that they not inform the public about the health benefits these foods confer. FDA intimidation has caused makers of foods that help prevent disease to remove these scientific statements from their websites. FDA has no problem, by the way, with makers of potato chips and other fried carbohydrate foods with promoting their junk foods as being heart healthy.
What about FDA censorship of prescription medications?
When it comes to prescription drugs, the FDA does not allow companies to inform consumers about life-saving off-label benefits. For example, There is an extensive body of evidence that the anti-diabetic drug metformin may help prevent and not just treat type 2 diabetes. Metformin, in fact, may also prevent and help treat certain cancers. Based on Life Extension Foundation's analysis of the published scientific literature, virtually every cancer patient should be taking metformin, as it functions via multiple mechanisms to inhibit tumor cell propagation. Metformin, by the way, was approved and used in Europe decades before the FDA allowed Americans to have it. Millions of diabetics died prematurely as a result of the FDA's delay in approving metformin. When metformin was first approved in the U.S., the FDA granted its manufacturer an exclusive status that caused the price to be many times higher than what the Europeans were paying for the identical medication.
Bill, you've written several books. What motivated you to write this book, Pharmacracy?
For 31 years, the Life Extension Foundation has sought to accelerate the development of therapies to better treat the diseases of aging and gain control over aging itself. Standing in our way are swarms of government bureaucrats armed with convoluted powers that suffocate medical innovation. We believe if it were not for the dictatorial powers bestowed on the FDA by our Congress, that cures for many of the killer diseases of aging would have been discovered by now. So I wrote this book for the purpose of consolidating what has already been published in the public domain about the lethal dangers of overregulation. Healthcare is now egregiously overpriced. Side effect-laden drugs remain on the market, while life-saving therapies are delayed or suppressed altogether. Congress must amend the law to tear down the roadblock of overregulation so that free market forces can slash medical prices while developing safer and more effective treatments.
I must ask you, why do you believe concerned citizens should purchase this book?
The artificial high price of medicine is bankrupting the United States. Medicare and other government programs are technically insolvent. That means that government insurance programs that are supposed to take care of virtually everyone watching this program won't be able to cover their future obligations. Pharmacracy outlines how deregulation will solve this nation's healthcare cost crisis.
Realistically speaking, how will Pharmacracy be able to change today's allegedly crooked system?
Pharmacracy provides a blueprint as to how the healthcare cost crisis we currently face can be logically resolved. Citizens will learn why medicine has become unaffordable and how they can participate in restructuring the antiquated way medicine is practiced in the United States today. The benefit will be affordable access to medical care, better ways of preventing illness, and non-toxic cures for killer diseases that confront aging individuals. The price of Pharmacracy is only $24. Each person who orders this hardcover book will get a free subscription to Life Extension magazine so that they are kept fully informed about proven methods to stay healthy that are overlooked by conventional doctors. So for only $24, anyone in your audience can participate in our campaign to tear down the bureaucratic barriers that deny us access to safer and more effective medical therapies, while simultaneously sparing Medicare and other government health programs from bankruptcy.
This has been most interesting, and I believe your astonishing book will certainly create waves while inspiring all who read it.
Thank you so much, Richard, for giving me the opportunity to enlighten your audience to this critical subject.
Thank you. This concludes our special show for today from On Location in South Florida with Bill Falloon. I'm Richard Peretz. Thank you for being with us.
This essential book is only $24, and you'll also get a free subscription to Life Extension magazine. You'll always be up to date on all of the proven ways to stay healthy, including therapies that conventional doctors simply overlook. Please join us in our campaign to enable better and safer healthcare, and also help save Medicare and other government health programs from bankruptcy. Get your book today.
This essential book is only $24, and you'll also receive a free subscription to Life Extension magazine. Get your book today.